Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. I'm going to take advantage of that bright light coming in the windows. It's called the sun. I haven't seen much of that lately. Anyway, this is going to be about my winter resting dendrobiums, and I'll include some oddities in here where I disagree with the books. And the reason I can disagree with the books is that I don't grow them that way, and they do fine and they bloom. So it's a contradiction in some of the prescribed ways of doing things, shall we say. It's, always more than one way to skin a cat. Just don't let me catch you. Right, so taking advantage of the light, I'm obviously going to be stopping and starting with the camera because I haven't prepared and got things down, so I'm going to get plants down one at a time. We'll have a look and we'll have a chat at them. But first of all, you have to stop and think, why are these winter resting types? And a lot of those included in that group will be deciduous orchids. They dump their leaves during the winter time, and they do it along with the trees, because where they come from is mainly either semi-deciduous or deciduous forests that drop their leaves. The reason they drop their leaves, the conditions are harsh enough that the trees can't support that amount of greenery. So they drop their leaves, they reabsorb their nutrients, dump their leaves and start again in the spring when the better weather comes. That's what, virtually all of the trees in the UK do, unless they're conifers. So they come from places where the winter conditions are harsher. They're going to be from parts of the world that tend to get this two seasons. A wet season, growing season, i.e. what we would call summer, or spring and summer, and some of the autumn, and then a drier season, which we can call winter. But they're not strictly speaking summer and winter seasons from those parts of the world. They're a wet season and a drier season. And the orchids that come from those sort of places adapt their growth patterns accordingly. So they tend to do most of their growing, all their new canes and everything, during that better times when there's plenty of water around, better light, slightly longer days, not a lot. Yeah, they don't get the huge differences in the day lengths like I would get in the UK, say. And then they get their drier seasons where it's a bit cooler, and depending on how high up they grow, it could be quite a lot cooler. Always bear in mind that just because an orchid is found in a certain place on a map is flat. The ground isn't, and there are high bits and low bits, and the high bits tend to be quite a bit cooler. Yeah, so you can get quite tropical orchids down in the valleys with evergreen forests, and then as you climb up the elevations up the mountainsides, those trees become more deciduous, and it gets cooler in the winter, and they're not evergreen forests anymore. Part way up that hill you might get a montane forest because of just the way the moisture climbs up the side and actually condenses as it hits a certain level. So elevation's quite important. So that's the reason they're winter resters. It's because of where they come from. They've adapted to match up with the conditions, and a lot of them are deciduous, annually deciduous. They grow new canes during the growing season, put on loads of leaves, and then come autumn into winter they dump the lot. Just a load of bare sticks sticking out of your pot or hanging off your bit of wood. And if you don't like that look, then that's not the type of orchid for you, because that's what they do, and they'll do it every year without fail. Right, let's have a look at some. Right, first one I want to look at is one of the biggies. This is my Friedrichianum, or as I should say nowadays, Friedrichianum Hanna. But this isn't completely deciduous. It's a bit longer to dump its leaves. If we come round here, these are the oldest canes, and these are leafless canes. Yeah. This is a set of canes here. First set I grew, I think, or second set. I don't think I've taken canes off of this one yet. Some of these have still got a few leaves on, but these are going to go soon. So this whole set of canes round here they're not far off completely losing their leaves. Now this is 2-year-old canes, still fully leaved. Yeah, and then up here are this year's growths. So these aren't even 1 year old yet, and in some cases they're still growing. Yeah, we've still got leaves coming out on some of these canes. They're not terminal leaves yet. Some of them are. So this has got a slightly strange one, and this comes into the category that I call semi-deciduous, not annually deciduous. Yeah, they've got a 2 to 3 year cycle before all the leaves are gone. Yeah, so on 2-year-old canes they're still fully leaved, and these are the canes that will bloom next year. These were the canes that bloomed this year, which is why it got its award, was the blooming on those canes. Well, let's have a think. You have a look at the number of canes here and where the blooms were. And now let's have a look at the canes that are ready to bloom next year. I think it's going to be a bit better next year. And then we've got all these new growths up here for the year after. So yeah, that's the way it goes with that one. And there are many of the resting type dendrobiums that come into this semi-deciduous category. Now, Friedrichianum comes from a place where it does cool down in the winter and it is a lot drier. It's not totally dry, but it's definitely drier. But it does tend to get a bit of mist and fog around and morning dew. So it's not a totally dry 3 month period. That just doesn't happen. So it still gets a bit of moisture. And in some cases it may even be growing on an evergreen tree. But it's more likely to be growing on a deciduous tree. But it varies. And that may be why it's adapted this way, to not dump all its leaves every year. Yeah? Because it can grow in a variety of environments. So it's semi-adapted. It doesn't keep its leaves for too long, not like some orchids forever, or virtually forever. So that's a semi-deciduous orchid. This apparently won't bloom unless it gets a cool winter rest, yeah, with some bright light. That's what it needs. That's what it gets, and it blooms. But I don't leave it dry for huge periods of time. It does get some water now and again, yeah? So that's how I deal with that one. Now this next one is Dendrobium hercoglossum, and to all intents and purposes it's an awful lot like the one we've just looked at, yeah? It's got some completely leafless canes around the back here. These are the oldest canes, yeah? It's got some canes with leaves on. It's got this year's new growth all sticking out round the top. And let's have a look at these growths. They're still growing. Let's have a look at these then. They're still growing. These are 2-year-old canes. They're still growing. That's this year's growth. They're still growing. This one continues to grow its canes all through the winter. So let's take this year's growth. They're growing, yeah? They will grow on through the winter. They'll go on through next season, and they'll grow on through the following winter. So it may look like a winter rester, but it isn't. It's a masquerader, and this has got the strangest of the dendrobiums that do lose their leaves, but not in a normal way. They take that little bit longer, but it's the fact that those canes keep growing for 2.5 towards 3 years before they finish. So as a consequence, the canes can get quite big because they just keep going. You can see the size of some of these. And this year's growths are not full size yet by any means. They've still got some, I noticed 2 have headed off around the back. Huh, you're going to be a nuisance, aren't you? Anyway, this will produce blooms come the spring all over this area. Some will pop out in places here. Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of these canes are right down here. This is a big plant. And it might even whack a couple of blooms out later in the year on this year's growths, and possibly in some other places. It has a mass blooming, and then it occasionally puts out a few blooms as the season progresses. So it's an oddity. It's not a winter rester, but it looks like it. So you've got to get to know your plants. So that's the oddity. And I've only got this one. I haven't got any others of what I call the long cane dendrobiums that lose their leaves. This is the only one I've got that grows like this. Yeah, Dendrobium hercoglossum, and it's still one of my favourite dendrobium blooms. Right, I've moved away from that position now, because although I thought I was taking advantage of the light, I'm probably ending up with silhouette, so I've had to move over here. Excuse the backdrop with my tatty fans, but there are very few places where I can hang larger plants. Now this is Dendrobium aphyllum. This is a true winter rester. It's annually deciduous. Yeah, so this is this year's growths down here. Have they finished growing? Yep, they're done. And over the next couple of months, all those leaves will turn yellow and drop off. By the time it gets to blooming, they'll probably all be gone. There might be a couple still hanging on, but there won't be many. Yeah, there's last year's growths around here. Yeah, totally leafless. This was a kiki that came from Alberto, from Italy, and quite honestly I'm pleased it's put up 2 nice canes this year, reasonable length, and given we had a heat wave, which this is not a warm grower, even its summer growth period shouldn't be too warm. It likes it a little bit cooler than some of the others, but this is a truly deciduous, annually deciduous dendrobium. It forms a typical pattern. Yeah, it'll bloom on these when it's good and ready in the spring. Yeah, and next year these are going to get treated differently. I'll show you why in a minute with one of the other ones, but these can start producing their new growths while they're in bloom, but often it waits till the blooms are finished to start the new growths. And in the UK, that gives it quite a short growing season compared with, you know, its natural habitat. So you've got to feed and water incredibly well to keep those canes actively growing right through the year. Yeah, and it is good feed and watering. They need virtually constant moisture. And a plant like this, annually deciduous, that's desperately trying to grow canes that big on a mount, really ought to be watered every day in the growing season. Missing a day, you're putting a little pause into the plant where it sort of thinks, oh, I was doing okay, now where's my water gone? Yeah, because you know, a mount can dry in a few hours, so it needs replenishing quickly. So keep them going, keep them growing. Now this has finished growing now, or has it? It's not going to grow any more leaves, but the canes are still capable of swelling and getting some more nutrients to store, because that's what these canes do in the winter. They store energy ready to push those blooms out, and that includes these canes that are not going to bloom. Yeah, canes on this type of orchid only tend to bloom once. Yeah, and then they're done. They still store energy, and if you take this overall energy of that plant, 2 this year's growths and 2 older canes. Yeah, so half of the plant here is old. Are these shriveled? No, they're still holding resources ready for the time when the blooms start to push out. Yeah, now in their natural habitat, those blooms would normally push out before the rainy season starts. So they're pushing those blooms out with stored energy, and that's all they've got. But then I get a short growing season, so I start to feed when those blooms, when the buds start to swell, not when the little nubbins appear, a little bit later. Give them a chance to sort of extend a bit from the cane. That's what I do. And then I start introducing some feed so that the blooms are not taking all the energy out of the plant. The idea being that it just might be able to start its new growths earlier. See what I'm getting at? So I'm starting its rainy season a bit earlier than perhaps would happen in the wild. Yeah? And I found that I get good length canes as a consequence. So that's an annually deciduous one. and I can't get anywhere near far enough away to get this one in shot. This is my Dendrobium nester. It's an anosmum cross. I can't remember what it's crossed with, but it basically performs the same way an anosmum would. It's a giant, and it's gone downhill. Does this look like it's gone downhill? You're probably saying, no, that looks like an absolutely brilliant cane. And yes, it is. But the word cane hasn't got an S on the end. Cane, singular. It only grew one this year. And yes, it's a beauty. But where's its partner? Last year it grew two. Yeah? So I class that as going downhill because it only grew one new cane. And I need to try and find out why. But if you look, if I get the camera down here and you just have a look, how long are the older canes compared with this one? This is a much longer, fatter cane than the two it produced last year. So it's not quite such a backward step. Yeah? Annually deciduous. These are older canes. And if you've got an anosmum or an anosmum cross, I don't care how tatty it looks with all these old canes, I seriously recommend you don't cut them off until they are totally shriveled and gone. It can set them back. Now why it has that effect, I don't know. But they seem more reliant on the stored energy come springtime, blooming time. So they need as many old canes as you can keep, as long as they're nice and big and fat. So let's have a look at this one then. I'd say that's almost 1 metre long. Has it finished growing? No, it's still at it. So I don't care that it's nearly a week into November. It's still growing, it's still going to get fed and watered. I can guarantee it's going to stop pretty soon because the temperatures have dropped down. Yeah. So again, this one needs the brightest light I can give it, which once the shade netting comes on, this will be in direct sun through the glass all through the winter. Yeah. But eventually these leaves will turn yellow over the next few months, and most of them, if not all of them, will be gone by the time we get round to blooming. And this is going to bloom from here up to about there, with 2 to 3 magnificent blooms per spike. It will be a good show. Not it could be or it might be, it will be. It's predictable. I've had it long enough to know exactly what the flipping thing's going to do. Therefore my treatment could remain the same. But I'm going to do the same with this one. I'm going to start its feed that little bit earlier as those blooms, as the spikes start to move away from the cane. It's going to start getting a bit more feed than perhaps it's had in previous years. The hope being that it may start new growth or growths that little bit earlier. But yeah, week into November, we haven't finished growing yet. It's going to be even longer. And this is a clumsy plant to have in here. Obviously the mount itself lives right up as close to the roof as I can get it. But every time I get it down, this lot down here knocks pots, catches on things. They're a clumsy plant to have around, unless you've just got oodles of... If I had a lovely greenhouse with a nice high roof and some sort of hanging rack down the middle and all these types of plants hung down in the middle and there was nothing underneath them except me banging my head on the canes, they'd be great. And I haven't got the luxury of that much space, but I'll find space for something like this. Why? You're looking at it. That's why. And add to that a lovely fresh raspberry fragrance that's quite strong, and you've got something pretty special. But you're lucky to get 3 weeks out of those blooms, which means you've got 48, 49 weeks of the year with nothing. That doesn't appeal to you? Then these might not be the best type of orchids. But I like them. I like the challenge of getting that winter rest right. And it did take a while. There were times when some of my winter resters just bloomed poorly, or in some cases not at all. I think I've got there now. So that's one of the biggies. Annually deciduous, hasn't finished growing yet. So throw your calendar away. We've just passed Halloween. How many books do you open that say, oh, stop watering and feeding on Halloween? It's not finished growing. Stop watering and feeding when it's finished growing. Let the plant tell you. Yeah? You do much better with them if you let the plant tell you what it wants to do. If it wants to grow, let it. Don't force it into a winter resting type of dormancy when it still wants to grow a bit. It won't be much more. Probably this may well be the last leaf. Yeah, but it's still growing, so we'll let it. Now this is, or these are, Dendrobium lodigessii, or gessii, however you want to say it. Annually deciduous, and the mother plant here hasn't done anywhere near as well this year as it did the previous year. Reasons unknown. It's an absolute kiki machine. It's how it naturally grows. This is its growth pattern. From a central base, it'll put up a cane, yeah, grow it in 1 year, drop the leaves, bloom, and then come the spring it'll push out kikis. And often, because I think in the wild this would often be growing like this, not like that, yeah? They often grow flat, can't even be found on the ground. So those canes arch over and the kikis root and form new plants, and it heads off in all directions. Well, that's what this one was doing back in the spring. It was doing a lot more of that. And what did I do? I took them all off and mounted them separately to start again. And these have grown on quite nicely. You know, some of those are a good couple of inches long. They all had roots. They're all a lovely deep bright green, so they're happy, yeah, but they're not blooming size. So what blooms could I possibly expect on here next year? And the answer is going to be hardly any. These canes have already bloomed. They might find the odd little space to get a bloom out. This is a new cane. It doesn't look large enough to bloom. There's some spaces on this one that might bloom. This one will bloom. And these might. So I'm not going to get many blooms on that come springtime next year. And then I need to see what it's going to do. Because if it doesn't start shooting out lots of plants from the bases, there's several plants on here. That's the main, there's two there next to each other. And then another one down here that virtually looks dead to me. And then it's got this extension that it pushed out and then rerouted a new base. So I need to see what this does in the spring. And it may be that this just becomes so tatty that this becomes the mother plant eventually. 2 years before that's liable to bloom. So it's going to grow next year when it will grow. The year after it will bloom. So that's a long wait. In the meantime, come next year, we'll see what this decides to do. And it's an unknown. I haven't had the plant a huge amount of time. But annually deciduous again, normal sort of treatment, winter rest, cool it down, brightest light you can give it, it'll dump its leaves. These won't. These will keep their leaves. They're unlikely to drop many. They may drop a few, but they're more likely to stay green. So we'll see how that one does. Right, this is Lindleyia, a new plant for me. That was bought at the beginning of this year. So a non-bloomer, it may bloom in the spring. I'm not holding my breath. I won't say it's a young plant on the grounds that it has 3 or 4 nice sized mature canes on it that are blooming sized canes, but the overall plant looks like it's been grown on from a seedling. So it's probably never bloomed. Sometimes they take a bit longer. I've got a conundrum with this plant. When I got it, it had a new growth coming out this side that failed. And not long ago, it pushed another new growth out this side that failed. You're a miserable failure, you left-hand side bit of plant. Whereas this side has pushed out this one, and that one up the back. And they're the best canes on there. And a recent addition. Another new cane. Hasn't even got its colour yet. Yeah. So this plant technically hasn't finished growing yet because that last new growth down there isn't mature yet. Nonetheless, I can stop watering and feeding that, or gradually reduce it, and not jeopardize that cane because of what's stored in there, which is a lot. Yeah. Now these take a very long time before they drop their leaves, sometimes into their 4th year. So if you've got one of these that's dropping all its leaves, it's not because it's having a winter rest, it's because there's something wrong with it. These lovely glossy leaves, which have got some watermarks on, tend to stay on the plant for some considerable time. It's still got its seedling leaves. Yeah? Now, some of the canes have dropped a leaf here and there, but not many. Yeah? These plants are a little confusing because they do need the rest. They do need to cool down, and there's just something about the fact that they've adapted these nice thick, almost cattleya-like leaves, big thick leathery leaves, that they can withstand the lower temperatures and the brighter light and the lack of water and feed better than some of the others, so they can hold their leaves. Nonetheless, it's a winter rester. So we'll see if we get any blooms on that. I hope so, but as I said, I've only just got the plant. If it blooms next year, I'll be over the moon. If it doesn't, I won't be upset. But it better bloom the year after. We shall see. And this is Jenkinsia, which, to all intents and purposes, is the miniature version of the Lindleyia we've just looked at. They're virtually identical. I mean, if I didn't put my hand out there, you'd hardly be able to tell that these canes and leaves are half the size of the plant we've just looked at. Less than half the size, so it's like a mini version. But RHS has now accepted they are 2 entirely distinct species. With Lindleyia, it's allowing the synonym aggregatum, which it's been known by for flipping years, which always makes me laugh, because when it was first described, it was Lindley's Dendrobium, hence Lindleyia. So where the hell did aggregatum come from? Anyway, I'm happy with Lindleyia, and this is Jenkinsia. They are different. They're different in size. Their blooms are different. One is bilobed, the other one isn't. The spikes come out from different places. Yeah. On one, I think it's the Lindleyia, they come out from the base of the cane, and on Jenkinsia they come out from part way up. You can see where some old spikes have been. So they grow their spikes from a different part of the plant. The blooms are different, distinctly different, hugely different in number as well. The Lindleyia produces many, many more blooms per spike than this one does. To me, if somebody put 2 of these, one of these and the Lindleyia next to each other in bloom, I can't even imagine anybody thinking they were the same plant. But for quite a long time, this was known as Dendrobium Lindleyi variety Jenkinsia, or aggregatum variety Jenkinsia. That idea has been dumped, gone. 2 separate species. This one tends to grow flatter as well. Another difference, yeah, tends to lie flat if you look at the growth here. Now what's this one up to then? Difficult to tell, but if you remember, much to a lot of people's annoyance, what was effectively a specimen plant was ripped off the mount and replanted to try and get some even growth and therefore more even blooming, which seems to have worked except in this bit here. I think one little plant failed in there, which I might be able to hook out because it's spoiling the look. Yeah, see, these will just come off. I think one of the little plantlets failed that I, replanted. But anyway, this one's taken off like a good one out to the side. So plenty of new growth here. Yeah. Down here, took off again. This one's expanded. This one's expanded that way, and that way. And if I move it round here, because half the plant's over the other side of the mount, so that we can get round the side here, we've got lots of growth heading out here. So it's done what I wanted it to do. Has it finished growing? No. I've still got a couple of new growths. Well, that was one. There's another one there in the centre of the shot if it's not out of focus. Better viewed from the side. So that's two. Any more? That's probably about it now. There's another relatively new one down the bottom. So it's virtually finished growing, and I'm not going to suspend letting this one go into its winter rest because I've got two new growths. Not when I've got 22 others that have already matured. I haven't counted them, that was a guess. Somebody's going to say, I can count 24. I hope you lot are like. So, true winter rester does eventually drop its leaves, but it takes its time. And pretty blooms, gorgeous yellow, but not too many. You only get 4 or 5 blooms on a spike, whereas with Lindleyia you can get up near a dozen, possibly even more. And they're slightly larger. But this is a much neater, compact plant. Yeah? So there is no reason why this shouldn't bloom in the spring. Whether it's going to be a mass blooming like it was last year, I don't know. It's had major disturbance this year. Ripped off its mount, all the old parts of the plant torn off and remounted, and had to get a new root system going and everything. So we'll see how we do with it. But you know, parts of this plant have already bloomed. And even though I've had this plant a while, I've never bothered checking. If a cane's bloomed, can it bloom again? And we'll watch. Let's pick a couple. If we pick the right hand side of the plant, you can see here 2 canes, both with stumps of spikes. That might not be the best 2 to pick, but it's the 2 that are obvious and easy to film. There's others in there that have had spikes as well. But let's just see if we get any more. Do we get a second spike off the other side of the cane? Is it possible? Can the canes push out a spike both sides of the cane? We'll have a look next year. We'll see what happens. Okay, so that's the last one I'm going to film. I've basically covered those that pretend to be winter resters that aren't, that carry on growing right through the winter, and in one particular case on in through the next one. And then we've got those that are annually deciduous and genuinely annually deciduous. They dump their leaves each year, store up their energy, push out their blooms on those bare canes, and then the new growths start. And you water and feed accordingly. Yeah. If your plant has still got spikes forming on those leafless canes and it starts its new growths, it's now trying to bloom and produce new growths from its stored energy. I'd get on and start feeding, quite honestly. Check your plant. Just look at your plant and think, what help does this plant require from me? Or does, at this particular point, does it require no help at all? That's the rest. Yeah. So let them finish growing, finish off their canes, get that terminal leaf. It won't be there for long on the deciduous ones, and then see how you do. But most of these winter resters, the true winter resters, you're going to have trouble blooming them if you can't cool them down. And it's not so much the actual temperature you get them down to, it's the difference from their growing season to their rest season. It's that difference that matters. Yeah? So get them as cool as you can, brightest light you can give them, reduce their feed down through October into November, depending on whether they're still growing or not. Yeah? And then by the time you get to December, most growth should have finished. Feed can stop, yeah, and a trickle of water now and again to stop the cane shriveling up. And the excuse me, the brightest light you can find for them. They'll take full sun through glass in the winter, providing it's cool. Yeah, they don't want to be warm and bright light. They might come back into growth too early, and that's the sort of thing that will stop them blooming. So cool them down, reduce everything down, and bright light, and you should get good blooms. And if all that sounds like too much of a faff, well then don't get those types of dendrobiums. There's plenty of others on the market. Your nobly hybrids. Okay, in books will say, oh, it needs a winter rest. No, it doesn't. You can get away with it. A bit cooler, bit brighter, yeah, they'll bloom. They may not bloom quite as brilliantly as they might have done given the better resting conditions, but they'll bloom anyway. A lot of them are coming into bloom now, I've seen. So we've had a funny year, so a lot of people have now got Nobly hybrids in full bloom. But what the hell they're going to do in March, April time, I really don't know. So they're out of season in effect. Still, these things happen. So that's the winter resters and what I'm up to, taking them into their winter rest period, because I'm not there yet. They're in the transition phase at the moment where I have to decide, have you finished growing? Are you ready? Yeah? Or should I just keep you ticking over a bit longer? And then we'll get there. And once I get the shade netting off, I'll show you how I position these to maximize their light. Yeah? We'll go into that a bit later on. So that's the winter resters. I love them. I wasn't so keen on them before I managed to work out how to get the flipping things to bloom though. I used to cuss them. All that blinking year I've spent looking after you and doing everything I thought was okay, and what do? Nothing. Well, I think I've got my head around it nowadays. Okay, that'll go into the Dendrobium series that I've started with the seasonal care heading towards winter, which is what it's all about. We'll pick up on these again, probably as they're starting to come out the other end, with maybe a bit in between. See you next time.